Well, hello, and welcome back as we continue on in the book of Matthew. This week we're on chapter 23, and we're still in Holy Week, the last week of Jesus' life before his crucifixion. So we come to here after we read Matthew 22, where we saw a lot of people coming to Jesus and having questions and tests for him, and he's responding to those. It almost seems like he's on the defensive for a minute as they keep coming, peppering all these tests after him, all these questions. And now this time we pivot a little bit, and we hear a lot more from Jesus as he kind of turns the tables on them, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as we look at Jesus' perspective here?
Yeah, Jesus definitely is putting them on the defensive this time, and this chapter is full of warnings. It starts off with warnings to the disciples about the Pharisees, about not being like the Pharisees. Then it shifts to warnings directly to the Pharisees. But it's important to remember that the disciples are right there with Jesus. He just was talking to them. And so I'm sure Jesus is eager for them to hear the warnings that he gives to the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were very religious people. They just searched God's word, the Hebrew scriptures, all the time, and thought of themselves as very faithful to God. And yet there were many things about their approach to spirituality that Jesus found wanting. And so I think Jesus wants his disciples to listen in to these warnings to the Pharisees. And clearly, Matthew, the gospel writer, wants his readers to listen in to these warnings. The Pharisees are no longer significant, probably, but he wants them to hear these. And so it's probably good for us, the modern followers of Jesus, to listen in.
Yeah, there's a lot that, as you'll see as we go through this today. And it can be kind of a denser chapter, I think, looking at this, but for us to make sure we learn from the words of Jesus. So how do you take a look at this chapter? Is there any framework you use for it?
Well, the latter part of the chapter are these woes, W-O-E, which are kind of warnings, or kind of, oh, how sad it is when you act like this. Some translations use the word alas, alas, a sad development. The chapter actually begins with a different kind of woes, W-H-O-A, whoa,
Okay.
like that. So if you allow me to be silly and use the word
yeah.
woe, that Jesus begins with saying, now, whoa, wait there, don't do that, and
Okay.
don't do that, and don't do that. So these are warnings to the disciples of what to avoid.
Okay, so
So
all the woes in this one.
I call
Okay,
yes,
yeah.
the chapter of the woes and the woes.
Okay,
All
I
right,
like
here
it.
we go. Well, shall we start with the woes?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, which woes? Yeah,
Okay.
we're in verses 1 through 12, I guess, is the first section there.
yeah.
All right,
Let's
what do you
start
see
with
there?
these are the warnings to the disciples about the Pharisees. So Jesus is talking to the crowds, or a lot of people in the temple where Jesus was teaching all day Tuesday and Wednesday, but the disciples are named as well. They're there listening in. And he warns them about the scribes and the Pharisees. Some people will have in their translations here, teachers of the law, which is a good translation. Scribes were professional writers. They knew how to handle pen and ink and papyrus and parchments. And they were frequently hired to make copies of the Hebrew scriptures. As a result, they came to know the Hebrew scriptures. As a result, they became teachers of the Hebrew scriptures. So that's the scribe thing. And many of the scribes were attracted to the Pharisaical way of thinking because they put so much attention on obeying the Hebrew scriptures. And Jesus says they sit on Moses' seat. In other words, they have kind of acted like they are the current version of Moses in bringing the law.
Oh, okay.
They take, it's their responsibility to bring the law to the people. But now Jesus turns on them and says, do what they teach, follow it, but do not do as they do. They do not practice what they teach. That's pretty harsh, right?
Yeah.
In other words, don't follow the example of the Pharisees. I guess that's a warning that we should take pretty seriously. There are some people who say good things, but whose lives don't exactly measure up.
Yeah. Do as they say, not as they do. Yeah.
Need to be careful. Here we are being teachers.
Yeah, that's true. I know. Be careful of our lives. Yeah.
We've got to humbly admit the same thing. Anyway, it's a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Then Jesus goes on with another criticism in verse 4. They tie up heavy burdens, meaning, remember we were talking earlier about the yoke of the law, the heavy burden. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others. This is a warning, this is a woe about two tendencies that the Pharisees had: legalism and, almost worse, judgmentalism, where they insist that other people understand and keep the law to the exacting standards that they expected of themselves, and if they didn't do it the same way the Pharisees did, they condemned them. And of course that's the way they treated Jesus as well. So here the thing to avoid is legalism and judgmentalism.
Okay.
Unfortunately, another problem that modern followers of Jesus have to face, right?
Yeah, it's pretty easy to go into those areas, and I don't know. I find it interesting because I think sometimes it's our way of trying to get it right.
Yeah.
We're just trying to make it a checklist so we can follow Jesus the right way. But this shows what can happen. We twist it in a way that it can become something totally foreign and not what Jesus was after at all.
Good point. You're right. Well, then the third woe, the third warning, the third thing to avoid is arrogance. And he talks about their arrogance in a couple of ways. First of all, in verse 5, he says, they do their religious deeds to be seen by others. And we understand what a temptation that is, what a danger that is. And Jesus has already addressed that very directly back in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, where he talked about almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. And his big warning in each of those was, don't do that to be seen by others. Yeah. So he's coming back to that point here in critiquing the Pharisees. They do it to be seen by others. And then he gives some examples. They make their phylacteries broad. Yeah. Do we all know what phylacteries are?
I'll tell you what I learned,
What
and
do
you
you-
can
what's
tell
a-
me if it's
tell
wrong or
me,
not.
what's a phylactery?
So it sounds like it's an interpretation of how the Old Testament says to bind the commandments of God. And was it like a little box? Did it have
was.
scripture in it?
It was a leather box.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was it on your wrist? Am I remembering that right?
And
Okay.
forehead.
Oh, okay. So a nice
Yeah,
little,
yeah.
And that they would make it bigger, which sounds so silly.
I know.
This isn't something I've ever seen, but it's sort of like, look at my phylactery over here. You
Okay.
know?
Now you're putting it on your right arm,
What's that
but
do?
no, put it on your left
Oh,
arm.
okay.
Yeah. Why? Because the left arm is closer to your heart,
Wow. Okay.
and so
Fascinating.
they took that seriously.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a leather box with leather straps, and inside was a teeny tiny little scroll
Okay.
that had that Shema on it.
It had that written out.
Yeah.
Oh,
love,
okay.
love the Lord your God.
Would you wear both of them at the same time?
I think
Okay,
if you
okay.
were a real good
Okay.
Pharisee,
Look
you
at
would.
me. Wow.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
And yeah, Jesus says, well, if they got a big box on their forehead, it's even more noticeable.
Okay,
So
yeah.
it was right there. They were leather straps
Huh,
are
okay.
like a headband.
Yeah.
So yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
That's
and then
exactly
the fringes, is that just a prayer tassel?
Prayer shawls, yeah.
Okay, a shawl. Okay.
Tassels
okay.
on their prayer shawls.
Okay, and they just made them longer.
Extra
okay.
long.
Okay.
To
Wow.
show off.
Yeah. And it just sounds so ridiculous to us now. But we do that in so many ways. I don't know, no examples are coming to my head, but ways where we do want to sort of show off our, look at me, I'm a great Christian, or I know this. And yeah, that it is easy for us to fall in that trap as well.
It's a great temptation. And then they love to have places of honor at banquets, best seats in the synagogues. My wife's father was a wonderful preacher for decades and decades, and he was a very humble man. But once they wanted him to sit at a head table up on a platform at a banquet, and he was the speaker for it, and he didn't want to sit up there, and he didn't like showing off at the head table and all that. And finally, it was about time for him to speak, and he pushed his chair back, but the back legs went off the back of the platform, and he reached out and grabbed the table, except all he got was a tablecloth, and pulled it off. And I just thought, oh, you poor man, you just tried so hard not to make a show of yourself. You're so humble, and you ended up making this big show of yourself. So whenever I think the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, I think of my poor father-in-law who had to deal with that. And to be greeted with respect and have people call him rabbi. Now, we usually translate the word rabbi, teacher, which is how they used it. But the word doesn't literally mean teacher. The word literally means great one.
Okay.
Oh, great one.
Okay,
So when they were called rabbi, people were using that as a term of high respect. And Jesus says, watch out for that.
Okay.
That,
Is
you
he
know.
saying not to use it, or to
Well,
just be careful?
I don't want to get too legalistic about it.
Because they still did have rabbis.
They still
so,
had rabbis, and rabbis were very important. And so, I'm not wanting to diss rabbis, but he is using this, I think, as a strong reminder not to be arrogant with titles.
Yeah,
And
okay.
that's something that Christians need to take seriously as well. So, avoid the wrong examples of Pharisees, avoid the legalism and judgmentalism of Pharisees, and avoid the arrogance of Pharisees.
That's a great summary of the first woes.
The first
W-H-O-A. Okay, now we're going to move on to the other woes, W-O-E. So here we have some warnings, and this is pretty extensive and long, and I think, I'll be honest, I feel like this is a passage I would normally kind of glaze through because it has a lot of different references to things. It could be kind of hard for us to sit with, but we're going to do our best to sift through it, and because like you said, these are warnings that really apply to us today, so we want to hear these. So take us through all of these woes. What do we notice about them?
This is a very challenging section, you're right, and so we'll just tell our viewers right now that we've met a challenge, but we're not going to avoid it. Once again, verse 13 makes it clear that he's still talking now to, not about, but to scribes and Pharisees, scribes, teachers of the law. He uses that term hypocrites again, which we saw back in the Sermon on the Mount, which has to do with actors on a stage, play actors, and that's a real criticism to use that term, but he frequently used it of the Pharisees. So woe number one is in verse 13 here, and his accusation is, you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. You don't go in yourselves. And then when other people want to go in, you stop them. You won't let them. Well, what in the world is this? Well, he's talking about entering the kingdom of heaven, which means the kingdom of God, placing ourselves under the sovereign reign of God and yielding our will to God's will. So how do they lock people out of that? One possibility is that Jesus means that by insisting on such a high standard of legalism, they make it almost impossible for people to seek God if they first have to obey 613 different laws before they even can be considered eligible for the kingdom, that's a way of keeping people out.
Okay.
And that idea, you don't go in yourselves, that may be a reference to their rejection of Jesus. Because Jesus himself said, I am the way and I am the gate. Following Jesus is the way into the kingdom. But they refuse to follow Jesus. So they're not going into the kingdom if they don't follow Jesus, is maybe what Jesus means by this, locking people out.
Yeah, that's pretty harsh, I would hope. That wouldn't be a criticism I'd want to hear.
Yeah, it is. But, you know, it makes me think, as hard as it is to hear about the Pharisees, it makes me think it may be possible that we do the same thing. I have to ask myself, do I ever act in such a way that literally discourages other people from following Jesus, even while I think I'm following Jesus? And I think there may be times in which we do that. And I do know that we are very tempted to declare other people unfit for the kingdom.
Yeah.
You know, if they don't live like I do or have the same views.
Interpret scripture the same way.
There you go.
I think of across denominations sometimes. Oh,
Yeah,
they're not really there.
Or lifestyle, things like that. It's easy for me to think, oh, well, they're unfit for the kingdom. And by doing that, by me disqualifying them, I'm shutting the door to the kingdom for them, maybe. I don't know. At least I'm trying to humbly consider that as a possibility.
Yeah.
Well, that was woe number one. We better keep.
All right,
lots
of woes to cover here.
We got 8 woes. We
so woe number 2.
Keep roll. So woe number 2. This one is in 2 parts. First, he says, "You devour widows' houses," and then second part, "For the sake of appearance, you make long prayers." These are 2 rather different things. Now, devour widows' houses obviously doesn't mean you eat them, but it does mean you take them. And this was, unfortunately, a habit or temptation of wealthy people in Jesus' day, and I suppose in our own as well. They would loan poor people money, and when people were slow to pay their debt, they would say, okay, then you have to forfeit that property if you can't pay me on time. And then they would take their property. Then they would not only be poor, they would be homeless.
Wow, okay.
And, it challenges me to think about, am I part of economic policies that disadvantage the most vulnerable people? And I'm afraid that sometimes we make economic decisions as a society that does in fact do that. Doesn't support the vulnerable, but disadvantages the vulnerable.
It's easy to be greedy.
Yeah. The other thing is this long prayers, but I think we already talked about that maybe in the Sermon on the Mount.
That it's similar
Praying
to kind
to
of
show
showing off your prayer. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. Can you remember when Christian worship services had pastoral prayers during the worship services?
I don't know if
We
I've
don't
ever
do that.
experienced that as much.
No, we don't do that anymore.
Okay.
We don't have long prayers. But that used to be a standard practice in worship services. The pastor, minister, somebody, an elder sometimes, would offer the morning prayer. And it could go on quite length. So long prayers is kind of a temptation. And very religious Jews in Jesus' day prayed 3 times a day. So there was a lot of praying going on. All right. So, woe 3?
Yeah, woe 3.
Woe 3. This one is hard for me to interpret real confidently. It says, "You cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell." So the idea is that Jesus says, I know you want to convert Gentiles to the Jewish faith, which they did. And some Gentiles became faithful followers of Yahweh. And we call them proselytes. And so that did happen. But Jesus says, you know what? You guys, when you make a convert, which sounds great, you make them twice as much a child of hell. In what way? Well, the interpretation that has made the most sense to me is that Jesus is criticizing them for converting Gentiles to a brand of Judaism that's based in legalism and judgmentalism, Pharisaical. And he said, that doesn't help anything.
You're leading them more astray.
They went from being pagans to be God followers who aren't really following God. They're just following their own legalism. So I don't know. Does that
makes sense to me?
Make sense?
Yeah, it really does.
There may be there are other ways to read that verse, but I think that is. And while I'm saying we need to be self-effacing here and apply these to ourselves, I have to ask the question: when we call other people to Christ, to faith, are we really calling them to Christ, or are we calling them to some brand of Christianity that we are comfortable with?
Okay, yeah.
I don't want to get too specific here and get partisan, but I think that's a danger that we need to avoid.
We want to be careful. We're really showing them who Jesus is,
Yeah.
not to follow ourselves or our specific beliefs, but yeah, really showing Jesus. I know that verse I feel like has a lot of bite to it, to think
Yeah.
of you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell. So that's something for us to really think about.
That's a hard one. Woe number 4.
Okay, so in verse
Okay.
16 now. Okay.
Yeah, verse 16. And this uses a beautiful oxymoron, a contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
Blind
A
guides.
blind guide, yeah.
That's what a phrase Jesus invented there. You blind guides. Now this one's about oath taking.
Okay.
And evidently in Jesus' day, people did swear by things, right, that they thought were holy or whatever. So
They made it that way,
Yeah.
their way of declaring. Yeah, I know it's interesting. I don't feel like we do that. Maybe we have some expressions, but we're not really thinking, I swear on the life of so-and-so or anything like that. That's less and less common, I suppose. But they
Yeah.
took that seriously to a point. I find it interesting how it says that you might swear by the sanctuary and feel like, that didn't really count. But if you swear by the gold of the sanctuary, that does count. And that shows a little bit of their difference in priority there.
yeah. I can remember as a young person people using expressions like, I swear on a stack of Bibles. Something holy, to say, I'm telling the truth. And I would swear. Or I swear on my mother's, what is the expression? My mother's grave. That's what people used to say.
Yeah, wow.
I swear on my mother's grave. So, yeah, there's maybe less of that kind of verbal swearing. And we're not talking about cursing here. We're talking about taking an oath on something that we consider holy. And Jesus simply has no time for that. And we've known that ever since the Sermon on the Mount, right?
That he says, let your yes be yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and how should we understand that, do you think? Yet your yes be yes.
Just to tell the truth. I think of, the fact that we even try to use those expressions shows that there's a problem, that we're thinking, someone might not really believe me. And we know that lying is pretty common. And I think that's what he's calling them out on. It's just say what you mean. Don't feel the need to swear on something and then go against it later. Don't swear on anything because you should just be telling the truth either way. Would you say that's correct?
I think that's exactly what he meant in the Sermon on the Mount, and that's what he means here. He's just reminding them again. All right, we'll keep rolling here. Woe number 5.
All right.
He's still calling them blind guides, but here he's talking about tithing. And it's not that he's critiquing tithing. Jesus seems to accept that as a meaningful part of generosity before God. He talks about, though, their tendency to tithe the minutia of their lives and then totally withhold the big spiritual principles of their lives, right? You tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. So in your research, did they really tithe spices?
I was finding that they really debated over it, like you said, the minutia, so that at one point they did tithe all the things listed, and then later they were like, mint might not count, and that idea, it just sounded so crazy to me to think that you're actually looking spice by spice, is this food? I think that might have been the idea, is this food or maybe flavor? I don't know. So that later they decided, mint, we don't need to tithe that. That's not part of whatever law they were looking at. Yeah.
So maybe you didn't have to tithe condiments. Salt and pepper.
Mustard. Yeah. Yeah.
But you do have to tithe other things. Well, at any rate, I don't want to make too much fun of them because I have a feeling that once again we fall into some of these patterns ourselves. Tithing has a long and very positive tradition in Judaism and in the Old Testament. We see it being practiced by Abraham after the rescuing of Lot, when he gave a tithe to the priest king Melchizedek. And then it appears in the law in a number of places. One of the most fascinating places taught me that tithing was not just something you did in worship, like tithing to the tabernacle or the priests or the temple or whatever. It also had a very socially beneficial function, and that passage in Deuteronomy 14 just really jumped out. Do we have time
Yes,
to read
yeah,
that?
you were saying there's, so which
Yeah.
passage is it?
It's 14, 28, and
here.
29, yeah.
Okay. So it says, at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, and the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands.
Isn't that beautiful? Every 3 years, the law says, save up your whole tithe, that's a tenth of everything you have, and make that available to the most vulnerable members of your society.
Yeah, to the people who need it. I love how it says that they may be blessed, that they can eat and be satisfied.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that lays the groundwork for a beautiful understanding of generosity for Christians. Tithing isn't taught directly in the New Testament of Christians, but generosity certainly is.
It's never
And-
meant to be this thing that you're parsing out specifically, as I mentioned about the spices, but rather that, they're being generous to the people who need it.
Yeah, yeah. Tithing, can be a wonderful discipline. It can also be a dangerous thing. I think tithing can be a barrier to generosity if we kind of get the big head and say, "Oh, well, if we're tithing, I'm being generous enough," when we could actually be way more generous. So it seems counterintuitive, but I really do believe that tithing can be a barrier to generosity. At least it can in my life. Tithing can produce pride. Tithing can also produce guilt. I've known people who have very limited means and can barely have enough disposable income to pay their rent and buy food and care for their families, and they're really guilt-ridden because they can't give 10% even and still have enough to provide those basic needs. And I don't think tithing is meant to do that as well. And then, I guess another way to put it is that we need to be careful that tithing is never the goal of giving.
Yeah.
I think I like to call it the springboard,
I like
or,
that.
or the
Okay.
starting point, or
Yeah.
the starting gate.
Like it says, for the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith, that tithing can be something that leads us into that.
Yeah, and that's interesting because Jesus views tithing as not just the way we treat our possessions, but the way we treat our whole spiritual lives. Justice toward other people, mercy toward other people, faith in God.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting passage
Okay.
about tithing.
Yeah.
Okay, we're on the home stretch of the woes here.
Woe number 6.
Yeah, and we probably could talk about woes 6 and 7 together.
Okay, so these are verses 25 through 28 together.
Yeah, because the point, it's 2 woes. The first one is about dirty dishes. You clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside it's full of, it's not clean. Like you wash the outside of a bowl, but not the inside. And the second one isn't about dirty dishes, it's about whitewashed tombs. Bodies are put inside tombs. Rocks are painted white, they look all pretty and clean, but inside there are bodies that are decomposing. Now, Jesus uses those 2 illustrations here of the danger of appearing to be religious and faithful, but having lots of unrepented sin in our lives. And in the first instance, in verse 25, at the very end of the verse, he mentions the sins of greed and self-indulgence. And then in the second part, at the end of verse 28, he mentions the sins of hypocrisy and lawlessness or disobedience.
Okay.
So I think we're all aware of the possibility of looking obedient, but having deep, unrepented areas within our lives.
Yeah, deep patterns of sinfulness.
Yeah, yeah. So Jesus is warning the Pharisees, but the disciples are listening, and we're trying to listen.
We're listening too,
We're
yeah.
trying to listen. All right, we made it to the 8th woe. This is a long one,
Okay.
but it can be summed up pretty easily, I think. Woe to you who reject the prophets and teachers sent from God with the truth. You don't want to hear it. And he says that your ancestors have done this all along. And of course that's true. I think of Jeremiah. If people want to study the book of Jeremiah sometime, he was terribly mistreated because of his message. He mentions two people down in verse 35, the blood of the righteous Abel and the blood of Zechariah, who was a prophet, a much later prophet. So he warns them against rejecting God's messengers. I think in the back of Jesus' mind, he also is very aware that they've rejected him.
Yeah. He knows where
Don't you
the
think?
story's headed. Yeah.
So it doesn't actually say that, but I just, okay, so you
Yeah,
agree?
it would make. I don't know. I think
Yeah.
there's so many, and we'll probably talk about this more in other chapters of Matthew. It seems like there are so many signs where you can tell he knows what's happening. Yeah, he
Yeah.
knows that they were trying to trap him, and he knows where his whole story goes. Even the themes of humility that we've seen already. We know that it ends with him being ultimately humbled, and what a model that is for us. So he knows that will end in his death in the same way. I don't know. That's how I'd like to think
Yeah.
about it. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think that's got to be in the back of his mind. Well, the very last part of 23 is a woe, a lament over Jerusalem, which is a little different. But it's similar. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. So here he's not talking just about the Pharisees and their rejection of God's messengers, but Jews in general have had that tendency. And yet, look how Jesus doesn't condemn them. He points out this fault in them. But look at the what does he wish he could do? Not condemn them.
He could gather them.
But
Yeah,
gather
yeah.
them, gather, and
Yeah.
look at read that for
The
us.
image,
It's just
says,
so beautiful.
How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings.
Yeah, so it's not Jesus who's rejecting them, because the next words where you stopped are, but
and you were not willing.
But
yes,
you were
yeah,
not willing.
yeah.
He
yeah.
said, it's not that God has rejected you. It's that you have refused to accept God's plan for your rescue.
I love that you're pointing that out, thinking of, I hear all these woes, and it seems like Jesus is angry, he's mad, and that can be a hard picture to sort of reconcile with, but you're right, to bring that image back in.
Yeah, I think the word woe implies not so much anger, but sorrow for the state that they have got themselves
he's like grieving
into.
on that, yeah.
People who were so close to God in some ways, loved God's word, but have fallen short in so many ways, and Jesus just is heartbroken because of that. And don't you love that he uses a feminine image for himself here as a mother hen? So that's good. This kind of reminds me that about my attitude toward Jews. I think we can share Jesus' sorrow for the fact that Jewish people seem to be so slow to accept Jesus as the Messiah, but not condemn them for that. Matched to that sorrow is a hope, yet that if we present the claims of the Messiah, our Lord Jesus, in a compelling way, that they might yet come to salvation.
There's still hope for that.
Yeah.
For all of us, Okay.
Good.
Well, any other concluding thoughts? That's our
it.
last
That's
woe.
it.
So
Okay.
yeah, we
So we'll have
got
to
through
say-
all the woes.
we'll have to say
yeah.
woe to
yeah,
the woes.
Yeah, lots of woes, lots of
Okay.
things to be grieving over. And again, I think this is a passage that can be kind of hard to muddle through as we hear this, and we're kind of wondering what to do with it. I love what Lee said at the beginning of this passage was he's directing it at the Pharisees, but he wants the disciples to hear it too. And I find it significant that Matthew recorded this and wanted his audience, the people he was with, to know these things. And a lot of these things do directly impact us today, that we want to make sure that we aren't doing these same things that Jesus was grieving over, that Jesus was finding sorrow in, that we want to be people who are following him in ways that it shapes us to have more mercy, to care more about justice, to be humble people, that we would be people who just let those values overflow from us. So I hope that you'll read through those woes, sit with them a little bit longer, and see maybe where you find yourself in them. What is God calling you to today as we strive to follow God with our whole hearts?